There have been a lot of changes happening across the economy in response to the coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the areas that was hit first and hit hardest has to be the travel industry. And so we're joined here today by Wright. He is the president of the Atlantic Canada Airports Association, as well as the CEO of Gander International Airports. Welcome, Reg.
Thanks, Don.
And we're also joined by Joyce Carter, who is CEO of Halifax International Airport Authority. Good morning and welcome, Joyce.
Good morning, Don.
So the first question I'm going to ask Joyce, and this is actually, I guess, in response to the background there and something I heard from one of my friends and colleagues over the weekend is, are airports closed?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, Don. It's a question we get a lot. And no, we're not closed. Certainly airports are essential infrastructure as we go through the pandemic. And when you think about passengers are restricted to fly, but as well cargo is so important at this time. So the background behind me is our hold room. I'm sure those who look at it think it looks incredibly empty, and that's because it is. So today, on average, at the beginning of May, we would, here at Halifax Stanfield, process 11,000 passengers a day, and we'll have roughly 200 passengers go through our terminal today.
Mm-hmm. That's a significant difference. Reg, what is it looking like for you in Gander?
It's very much the same. I tell people going through our terminal, you feel like you're a night watchman because there's very little activity. We're at about 2.5% of the daily passengers we would have a year ago today. So it's very surreal and very stark. The airport is, of course, open, as Joyce mentioned, for essential services. But obviously, there's been a massive curtail in the traveling public.
Mm-hmm. So the question now for both of you really is, what kinds of changes can people expect when they arrive at the airport? Now, one of the things I've heard is that you're now not allowed to travel on an airplane without a mask. So can you tell me a little bit, Joyce, perhaps you could start and tell me about what people can expect when they arrive at the airport now and the changes they're going to see as they try to board their flight.
That's a good question, Don, and certainly lots of changes are seen at the airport now and have over the past month. When you think about the requirements as one example to social distance and physical distance, now as you move through the airport from your point of check-in to your point of departure, we've instituted, as have other airports across Canada, protocols that see passengers distance from each other. It's frankly easy when you don't have many passengers coming through, but when you think about as we start to recover how that's going to continue, that will be a challenge for airports and something we will have to implement. You mentioned masks, so that was announced back a couple of weeks ago, and now as you make your way through the airport and certainly to board a flight, you're going to be required to wear a mask. So that is a change that was introduced that now our passengers are having to follow.
And would they actually be denied the opportunity to get on board if they didn't have a mask?
They have to present some sort of facial covering before they're allowed to board the aircraft. So if not a mask, they're able to use a shawl or a scarf, and those have to come off to identify yourself to board, but then are required to be worn on the flight.
So, Reg, you're with the Regional Airports Association. Are these restrictions or are these measures in place? Are they standard now across all airports?
Yeah, they're consistent across all airports, regardless of size. So you'll see the much the same thing as Joyce described, except at a smaller level, of course.
Mm-hmm. There were a lot of changes that came through in airports following 9/11. I mean, increased security measures that are still in place today. Are face masks the beginning of what we're going to see in terms of airport security measures for diseases now? I mean, is monitoring, testing going to become part of our airport experience?
Yeah, well, Don, I think if 9/11 taught us anything, it was that a massive security architecture sort of came from that. And I think, Joyce, our industry is very much braced for the fact that you'll have the same thing in terms of public health screening. And it's going to be a complex framework that really, from gate to gate, that's going to involve social distancing, more high intensity cleaning processes, more protocol. So we're braced for that. I think at this juncture, we have a sense of what some of that might look like, but a lot of it will be done through policy. So in terms of the specifics of it, what we do know is it's going to require a sizable investment, and that this pandemic's not our last. So we can't be in a position again where a pandemic breaks out and the transportation system is paralyzed. So now is the time, as we navigate through it, to get in place the infrastructure and the process to ensure the next time it happens, transportation can continue unfettered.
Joyce, you've been nodding a lot. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, Reg is very much right. Certainly, we anticipate additional screening measures, Dawn, for health and safety. And it's interesting that you make the comparison to 9/11. What you'll recollect, or what travelers may recollect post 9/11, is CATSA, the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, was born as a result of 9/11. So to Reg's point, when you think about additional health screening measures that may come into place, what are they going to be? We have already started as an industry, as an airport industry, to work really closely with our partners on what that might look like. And Reg is exactly right. The sooner we can get at that, the better, because it will be really important to be ready. Airports need to be ready and able and willing to serve our communities as we begin to recover. And so we expect lots of changes when you think about technology and what technology may be able to introduce in terms even of touch points around the airport. There will be lots, I think, of technological solutions that will help make that journey through the airport and onto the aircraft safer and healthier for everybody. As Reg points out, it's my first pandemic. It's probably not our last.
Mm-hmm. So are you able to give me, I guess, some hints on what those technological solutions might look like?
You know, one thing I wonder about is what's going to happen with facial recognition and screening, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we all now do a lot of our processes through the airport by handheld devices. And certainly, I think the less touch points you have through the system, the better that journey will be, the safer that journey will be. And I wonder where facial recognition, as one example, will go as we look forward to additional screening measures.
Reg, one of the things I'm thinking about here is the fact that, you know, airports have some measure of control over social distancing, over these various touch points and technological solutions. Then you get on the flight. And of course, your people are pretty crowded on flights. There's not nearly, I was going to say that social distancing is pretty much impossible on a flight. I mean, how do we overcome those challenges? Or do you think that even the way we're seated on planes is going to change?
Yeah, I think the airlines are doing some deep analysis and soul searching on that, because to your point, it's fine to keep people 6 feet apart while they're in the terminal, but the minute they're on the aircraft, there is no way, and I mean no way, that airlines are going to be able to fly economically while keeping a 6 foot radius among passengers. There's no way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's been so many gains made in aviation since its inception. I mean, in the early days, you'll remember that travel was really the prerogative of the rich. I mean, only rich people could afford to travel. There were aircraft were very sparsely populated, and they paid enormous airfares. And we've come a long way to making air travel accessible to all, inclusive of the middle class. So there needs to be a means that people can continue in the current model to get on board an aircraft with confidence and travel safely. But the idea of reducing seats and sneeze guards between seats and things on aircraft, there's going to have to be a scientific approach to that restores consumer confidence. Because I can tell you, you can't take that middle seat out, and you can't create in-aircraft buffers, and the industry won't be able to do that economically.
Right. Well, if you look at the whole 6 foot radius that people talk about as being safe for the whole social distancing, that would really almost be one seat per row in some instances.
Yeah.
And that's just economically unfeasible. It's not going to happen.
I don't view any scenario. Joyce, I don't know if you have any insight. I think the airline model will change to some extent, as will the airport model, but I don't envision anything where with current fleet you could do that profitably, which would really paralyze the world's economy. There is a need for people to be able to return to air travel as a means to facilitate trade and for social connections and for tourism. A lot of the recovery post-COVID hinges on the ability for air travel to work as it did before.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how that will work. I don't know how long the social or physical distancing measures will be in place. I certainly do know that the carriers are working really hard on other safety measures on board the aircraft to allow air travel to continue.
Do you think we'll ever see some form of actual, some form of health testing within the airport before you're allowed to board a flight?
Certainly other airports around the world have already started that. So some quick testing that will provide indication of disease is not that uncommon. Some of the airports in Asia have already begun that. And so I know our federal government is looking at as an example, Don is looking at the reliability of those tests for all kinds of, in addition to air travel, but for all kinds of other
Right.
options as well.
Reg, just looking at what's happening or what has happened in the past. So, we've had, when the price of oil went up, there were surcharges on tickets, for flights because, to pay for these extra fuel fees. And similarly, there have been increased security fees added onto the price of a ticket. Do you think it's fair to say that post-pandemic, that air travel is probably going to be more expensive?
Well, it's an excellent question. It's going to hinge on a number of things, including what we just discussed is what capacity will airlines have to carry passengers without restriction. Air transportation is intensely competitive. I think one of the very real concerns that most airports have in Canada right now is, to the extent, what does the aviation landscape look like on the other side of recovery? So, right now, if you're an airline, you've been presented a complete reset button and a major crisis, but you can really start to rebuild your route network from scratch. So decisions based on what you fly, where you fly it, and how frequently are all, we're back to a blank slate now in terms of what that works. My concern is, Gander Airport CEO, is that I think very small spoke airports will be the very last dogs to the bull in terms of air service being restored. I think the major hubs are really going to be the first and optimal choice domestically for them to resume meaningful service. So to the extent that airfares remain competitive after, obviously any new protocol in terms of safety or security or public health is in some shape or form costs money and gets handed off to users. The other thing is, will there be any airlines which will not survive the pandemic? Because as you reduce capacity and competition, obviously, prices increase. So I can't say anything definitively. I'd be interested to hear what Joyce thinks about it.
What I'll add to that, Don, is one thing we know for sure is when you look at the airports, which are a very important piece of the business and of the puzzle, is we currently have no revenue. So again, if I draw your attention to the terminal building behind me, we are non-share capital corporations. We get our revenue mostly from passengers. To Reg's point, the larger airports have a bit more flexibility because we may have cargo, we may have more land leases, but really passengers going through our terminal building, boarding flights, pay us airport improvement fee, pay us revenue through retailers, pay us in different ways. And when you remove all sources of revenue from an organization, such as an airport authority, you can only operate that way for so long. So we together as airports are modeling what our financial position looks like going forward, and as our business recovers. And when you look at that, it is almost impossible without assistance from our federal government, and we've had some assistance. We're very grateful for that. But without additional assistance, it's almost impossible to see a model that doesn't have substantial increase in our fees. Our fees are borne by the passenger in the end. So be it the airport improvement fee or be it the charge that we charge carriers for using our airport, that ultimately all gets passed on to the passenger. So it is difficult right now, not knowing how we're going to come out of this financially, to see a scenario where the cost to travelers does not go up.
Yeah. Don, I mean, if you look at it, just to add to Joyce's point there, if you look at it on a regional basis for Atlantic Canada, we're looking at 4.2 million fewer passengers for this year. Everyone's operating about 5 to 10% of what they did last year. Losses are going to be to the tune of around $120 million spread among the airports in Atlantic Canada. So this constitutes a sizable and existential challenge for our airports. And, you know, I think we're going to be profoundly changed in the absence of government intervention and support. Because it's very, you know, operating any business on 5% or 5 or 10% of your revenue. We're doing an awful lot in terms of rationalizing spending, deferring capital plan, layoffs in some cases, but you don't save your way to profitability when you've got 10% of your revenue. It is very much a revenue problem, and we're dealing with this in stages. So if it's a protracted recovery that's going to take a long time and is uneven, it's really going to stretch a lot of our airports to their very limit.
Right. Looking at airports and their role, the service that they provide, I think it's fair to say that it's one of the most accurate barometers of the health of the economy that there is. And the truest sign of when our economy is back to normal, when people are operating as they want to, we'll say at 100%, is when we're allowed to re-engage in non-essential travel. So thinking, you know, visiting family on the other side of the country, going on vacations, just something that I guess even business trips, it could be difficult to understand. Is it possible to give a definition of what is non-essential travel and when we think that we're going to be able to, you know, take to the skies once more?
I'll start, Reg. To define what is essential travel is certainly linked directly to the crisis. And so when you think about the travel required to help respond to the crisis, that is what currently is being defined as essential. So if you're in a business that you have to travel for that purpose, then that's considered essential travel. And to Reg's point, this is why, you know, last week when I looked at the number of passengers through Halifax, similar to Gander, we only saw less than 5% of our normal travel because it is a very small group. What is compounded is as well the restrictions on self-isolation between the borders, and not only to the US, but the borders between the provinces. And so you're exactly right, Don, when you think about how that starts to open up as people are freer to move and as they feel safer to move between the provinces. Certainly the travel industry is going to be one of the last to recover. There'll be pent-up demand for sure. People will want to connect with loved ones on a leisure basis. But even when you think about business travel, look at how we're doing our meeting today, right? So how many more meetings in the future will be done this way because either it is less expensive or people don't feel safe to travel. We're predicting the recovery from a Canadian perspective. And again, it's very different in each region and it's different by airport. When you think about the number of travelers that passed through airports in Canada in 2019, in a best case scenario, we don't expect to be back to those levels until 2024. So it's 5 years before we see travel to the extent we saw pre the pandemic.
That's a long recovery timeline for sure. Reg, did you want to add something to that?
No, I get the same question. What constitutes non-essential travel? And I would say if it's fun, if there's an element of fun to it, or if it could be done from home. And to Joyce's point on the Zoom business that we're all in business here, and we'll know in the sales cycle that if you meet with a customer twice face to face, the third time around, it's okay to call or teleconference. So there's a whole new normal that's going to be post-COVID, post-lockdown. Are people ever going to congregate in groups together again? Will the convention business return in a meaningful way? Will anyone set foot on a cruise ship again? What kind of places will we seek out for vacations? Will they be our backyard? Will it be urban centers? Will it be sparsely populated? Will anyone ever have a big wedding? All of these things, to some extent or another, affect demand for air travel. So we don't know yet. We can only theorize right now. But I do think we'll be inheriting a very changed world at the other side of it.
Yeah. And one of the things that's key, Reg, that I'll note I didn't mention already is a vaccine, right? So once a vaccine is in place, then to Reg's point, I think you'll see people feel more comfortable traveling for the types of events that Rach just mentioned.
Mhm. So still so much that's unknown before we can actually take off once more.
Yeah.
Thank you both for your time and for explicating this so thoroughly. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Thank you for your interest.